Okay, so you want to understand the Maya civilization. You picture step pyramids rising out of the jungle. You think about hieroglyphs, blood sacrifice, and a calendar so precise it still gets misquoted as an apocalypse prophecy. What nobody told you is that the real story of the Maya isn't carved into a temple wall. It's buried in something far less glamorous: cacao ledgers, tribute lists, and the backs of porters who carried an entire civilization on tumplines because they had no wheels and no pack animals to do it for them. Here's a number to sit with. Spanish colonial records from the Yucatan describe a functioning cacao bean currency so precise that a rabbit cost around 10 beans, a slave could run close to 100, and counterfeiters were caught hollowing out cacao shells and refilling them with dirt to pass as real currency. This wasn't a barter society trading favors. This was a civilization with inflation, forgery, and price lists, without a single coin, a single cartwheel, or a single ox to pull a plow. Which brings us to the question at the center of this video: how does an empire-sized economy get built by hand, in dense jungle, with no draft animals, no wheeled transport, and no central government at all? To answer that, you have to throw out the idea of the Maya Empire. There wasn't one. The Maya world was a patchwork of dozens of independent city-states: Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, each ruled by its own king, or a hall. Each competing for trade routes, tribute, and prestige. It functioned more like Renaissance Italy than Rome: rival courts, shifting alliances, occasional royal marriages to seal a trade deal, and near-constant low-grade warfare simmering underneath all of it. And baked into that system from the start was a fatal tension. Prosperity depended on land that was thin, tropical, and unforgiving: limestone bedrock covered by a shallow layer of topsoil that could exhaust itself within a few growing cycles, farmed by a population that kept growing to feed cities that kept demanding more. Every king's legitimacy rested on being able to feed his people, arm his warriors, and outbuild his rivals. That meant the economy could never really rest. It had to keep expanding, year after year, against a ceiling the land itself had already set. Maize was the foundation, but maize alone couldn't feed cities of tens of thousands of people. Farmers built raised fields in swampland, terraced hillsides, and rotated slash-and-burn plots on cycles as short as 2 years in the most crowded regions. Modern estimates put classic period population density in parts of the southern lowlands above 200 people per square kilometer, comparable to parts of pre-industrial Europe, achieved entirely without plows or livestock. That's the part that should stop you. Everything else in this video, the pyramids, the trade goods, the armies, was funded off the back of farmers working fields by hand, with a digging stick and fire, on soil that gave out fast. Surplus grain didn't stay with the farmer either. A share moved upward as tribute to the lord who controlled the land before a single kernel got anywhere near a marketplace. Move outward from the farm and you hit trade, and this is where it gets staggering. Obsidian from highland Guatemala, jade from the Motagua Valley, salt from coastal flats, quetzal feathers from cloud forests, and cacao from the lowlands moved along routes stretching hundreds of miles. With no wheel in practical use and no domesticated beasts of burden, every one of those goods moved on a human back, using a tumpline across the forehead, or by canoe along river and coastal routes like the trade circuit through Chetumal Bay. Archaeologists estimate a single porter could carry roughly 23 kilograms, about 50 pounds, for 20 to 25 kilometers a day. Scale that against the volume of obsidian and cacao moving through a hub like Chichen Itza, and you're looking at thousands of porter days of labor behind a single shipment. Think about what that means logistically. A load of obsidian blades quarried in the highlands of Guatemala, destined for a workshop in Tikal, might cross 100 kilometers of jungle terrain, changing hands between relay teams of porters before it ever reached a toolmaker's bench. There was no cart to speed that trip up, and no horse to shorten it. The entire value chain ran on the calculated stamina of human legs, which means every luxury good you associate with Maya elites, every jade pectoral and quetzal feather headdress, carried a hidden transportation cost that dwarfed the cost of the raw material itself. Here's where the common assumption breaks down: the idea that Maya trade was small-scale, local exchange between neighboring villages is incomplete. What actually existed was a specialized, long-distance commercial network sophisticated enough to have its own patron deity, the traveling merchant god, associated with cacao and the marketplace, and its own professional merchant class that operated semi-independently of the kings. Inside the cities, that network fed into open-air marketplaces, or Wik Kiwik, where households traded surplus food, cloth, pottery, and tools on top of the luxury goods coming in from outside. Jade in particular functioned almost like a reserve currency for the elite. A single carved jade ornament could represent months of a skilled craftsman's labor, and rulers were buried with jade in staggering quantity specifically to display and destroy that wealth in front of the whole city. That's not a decorative choice. That's a funeral acting as a public accounting statement. None of this moved for free. Commoners owed their lords a mix of goods and labor called patan. Tribute, that labor built the roads, the sakbiob, raised limestone causeways connecting cities across the lowlands, some running over 100 kilometers, wide enough for processions and paved, smooth enough to survive intact more than 1,000 years later. It quarried, hauled, and plastered the stone for the pyramids. It dug the reservoirs that stored water through the dry season, without which a city the size of Tikal simply could not exist. Here's the second reframe. The popular image of slaves whipped into building pyramids is incomplete too. Most monumental construction ran on rotating, seasonal corvée labor, free farmers cycling through labor duty between planting and harvest, the same way medieval European peasants owed days of work to a lord. It wasn't slavery in the chattel sense. It was something closer to a labor tax, paid in sweat instead of grain, and it meant every stone block in every pyramid represented time a farmer wasn't spending feeding his own household. Put a number on that labor tax, and it becomes staggering fast. El Mirador's La Danta complex is estimated to contain over 2.8 million cubic meters of fill and stone. Construction estimates suggest it could have required tens of millions of person days of labor across generations. That's not one project. That's a standing construction economy, generation after generation, absorbing labor that could otherwise have gone straight back into farming or trade. And stone was only half the cost. Maya plaster demanded enormous quantities of burned limestone, which meant burning through immense volumes of forest for fuel. Some researchers estimate that resurfacing a single major temple could consume the equivalent of 20 hectares of forest for the fires alone. Every gleaming white pyramid you've seen in a photograph represents a small deforestation event, a permanent transaction where standing forest and the rainfall patterns it helped sustain got converted into limestone plaster and royal prestige. This is where the numbers stop being abstract. Captives taken in the near-constant warfare between rival city-states weren't just political trophies, they were an economic input. Elite captives were ransomed, displayed, or sacrificed to cement a king's legitimacy. Lower-status captives were absorbed as forced labor, feeding the same tribute and construction machine that ordinary commoners already worked inside. Skeletal evidence from sites like Canquin shows populations under real physical stress in the centuries before collapse. Signs of malnutrition, arrested growth in children, and overwork stacked on top of a system that was already extracting nearly everything the land and its people could give. So remember that central question: how do you build an empire-sized economy by hand, with no wheels and no draft animals? The uncomfortable half of the answer is, you don't, without eventually running human bodies as close to their limit as you run the soil. And that's exactly what broke it. Between roughly 800 and 1000 CE, the great southern lowland cities emptied out in what's called the Terminal Classic collapse. For decades, the popular explanation was a single mystery cause: plague, invasion, alien theories that show up in late-night documentaries. That explanation is incomplete. Lake sediment and cave formation records now point to a multi-decade megadrought layered on top of soil already exhausted by centuries of intensive farming, forests already stripped for plaster fuel, and city-states locked in escalating warfare over shrinking resources. The tribute economy that built the pyramids had already stretched commoners to their limit before a single drought year hit. There was no reserve, no slack in the system, no stored surplus large enough to ride out a multi-year failure of the maize crop. When the rains failed, there was nothing left to absorb the shock. Trade routes broke down first, because porters and canoe traders had no incentive to carry goods towards cities that could no longer pay tribute back. Then, construction stopped. The last unfinished monuments at several sites still show tool marks frozen mid-project. Then, city by city, populations simply walked away. Within a few generations, cities that had held tens of thousands of people stood empty, reclaimed by the same jungle their labor had spent 1,000 years pushing back. It's worth noting the collapse wasn't uniform. Cities in the northern Yucatan, like Chichen Itza, absorbed migrants and kept trading for centuries longer. The economy didn't vanish. It contracted, violently, to whatever scale the land could actually sustain. It's worth zooming out here, because this isn't just an ancient story. A civilization that grew its economy by converting forest into farmland, farmland into surplus, and surplus into monumental prestige projects, all while quietly eroding the resource base underneath it, is a pattern that shows up again and again in economic history. Modern supply chains run on the same logic of specialization and long-distance dependency the Maya trade network pioneered with cacao and jade. Modern economies still get run on thin margins, with just-in-time surplus and almost no reserve, right up until one shock, a drought, a blockade, a bad harvest, breaks the whole system at once. The Maya didn't need coins, wheels, or a central government to build something that looked, functionally, like a market economy. They needed labor, land, and trust that the trade routes would hold. When that trust broke, so did everything built on top of it. The Maya civilization was not a mysterious vanishing act. It was an economy that ran on human backs, tribute ledgers, and cacao currency, and it grew until it outran what its own land, labor, and trade routes could carry.